Hi, I'm Michael Alvarez, co-director of the Caltech Ronald and Maxine Lind Center for Science, Society, and Policy. And today I'm happy to introduce Beatrice Magistro, who's currently a postdoctoral research scholar in computational social science here at Caltech. And in the fall of 2025, later this year, she will be an assistant professor in AI governance at Northeastern University. Before coming to Caltech, Beatrice was a postdoctoral fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto and the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. She worked there with Peter Lowen, one of our colleagues. Beatrice received her PhD in political science from the University of Washington in Seattle in 2021. So it's great to have you here and have an opportunity to chat with you today.
Thanks, Mike. I'm very excited to be here.
So your research is at the intersection of political economy and political behavior. And you focus much of your research on AI and automation. So can you tell me a little bit about your research?
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about how it all started. I was actually an undergrad in econ, so I got my bachelor's in economics. And I remember vividly realizing that I had learned about all these optimal policies, but I didn't see any of these optimal policies being implemented. Mm-hmm. And so I kept wondering, why is that? And I realized that the answer was politics. And so I really got into political science and political economy. And I would say that from then, my guiding question has been what are people's mental models of the political economy? Do they really think like economists? And so I think that was my starting point, and I started to apply that lens to issues like globalization during my PhD. And then I applied to this postdoc in Toronto with Peter, who then became one of our colleagues. And basically what I started to do in Toronto was kind of ask the same questions, but related to a new and rising issue, which was automation first and then AI. And then I think that's also what brought this group together, because when I got to Caltech and I started my postdoc here, which was initially more about political behavior and climate change, which I think we're going to talk about later. But basically I told Mike how I really enjoyed working on topics like AI and the political economy of AI and political behavior. And he basically suggested he was interested too, and that the center would be interested in answering some of those questions. So I joined the Toronto and the Caltech group, and we started working more and more on topics of especially the political consequences of AI. And so we started with the first, we could call it a pilot project, and it was the fall of 2023, where we got funds from the center and funds from SSHRC, which is the Canadian NSF, and with Sophie Borwin at UBC and Peter Lowen, who's now at Cornell, and Barb Bunikowski at NYU, we started this project with YouGov on basically people's perceptions of generative AI. And our central question was what the political consequences of AI are going to be, because we don't quite know yet. And I would say that was our starting point, which led to a publication in the American Journal of Political Science and 2 papers currently under review. And that was our starting point, because we then applied to several grants and got a SSHRC grant to answer these questions on both the demand and supply sides of AI. So not just about what people's perceptions of AI are, but also what politicians' perceptions of AI are. And I think we're going to be the first ones answering that question. And I think that's going to be very important to determine also the kind of policies that politicians are going to implement in response to such a novel and unpredictable, in a way, shock as AI is going to be.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your conception of mental models? Because it's different than just someone's opinion. What exactly do you mean by a mental model of something like AI?
Exactly. So basically what I mean is, what are people's causal beliefs about the economy, about what's really happening in the economy, right? And so what I argue is that there are different types of mental models, right? So we often think, if we're trained as economists, we're trained to think as economists. And so for instance, for things such as AI, we might be trained to think that AI may actually be complementary to jobs, for instance, in the economy, right? That AI is not just going to destroy jobs, and so that's more of the substitutionary view, but that alongside destroying some jobs, it's probably going to create even more jobs, and so that's like the complementary view, I would say. But we kind of take for granted that everybody thinks like an economist. So for instance, in this specific case, that everybody is going to have a complementary view of AI. And what we argue and what we actually test in one of our papers is, well, we ask whether people indeed see the economy, in particular in this case, in relation to AI, whether they see it as economists or if they see it differently, right? And we actually find that the public is pretty split. So certain people have more of a substitutionary view, so they think that AI is going to replace people, that AI is going to be bad for workers, it's only probably going to be good for companies, it's not going to be good for consumers. And then we have complementers who are, I would say, more aligned with mainstream economists, thinking that AI might be a great opportunity, that it may create more jobs than it destroys, that it may be good not just for companies, but also for workers and for consumers. And then we have two other groups that we identify. So we have the uncertains, and these are people that basically are more likely to answer don't know to a lot of these questions on what the likely consequences of AI on the economy might be. And then we have the skeptics, which we identified as the group that basically always answers that there's not going to be any changes led by this technology. And then we look at how these different types of people might actually have different political and policy preferences. So for instance, I think what's interesting in the US context, at least for now, we find that substitutionary people are more likely to be Republican than Democrats, and Democrats are more likely to be complementary. What I think is even more interesting is that these different types of people have different policy preferences. So for instance, substitutionary types are more likely to favor things such as restricting immigration or trade, whereas the more complementary types are more likely to favor things such as retraining people who lose their jobs due to technology or compensating them. So for instance, unemployment benefits. And I think this is especially important because this is where the political consequences of AI might come from.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell also a little bit about how you go about measuring these mental models? So you talked about complementers and substitutors.
Yeah.
So how do you determine whether Mike here is a complementer or a substitutor?
Yeah. So basically what we do is we start from 8 questions. So we have 8 questions in our YouGov survey where we ask people different types of questions about what the effects of generative AI might be for firms. So for instance, whether their profits are going to increase or decrease. For workers, so whether, for instance, firms who adopt generative AI are going to be hiring more or less or the same, whether their wages are going to go up or down or stay the same. And then we ask some questions about consumers, so whether, for instance, the quality of products is going to increase or decrease, and prices, and then whether they think that generative AI will be more complementary or substitutionary. And then what we use is actually we use LCA to actually, which is a statistical method, to actually determine based on the data how many groups there are and how these groups are similar based on the types of answers that they've given to these questions. And so basically with this method, what we find is that the optimal number of groups is 4, and these 4 groups can be best explained by, well, these 4 categories that we have decided, which is complementers, substitutors, uncertains, and skeptics. And so basically this is data driven, so we don't like super arbitrarily decide who is who. And then once we have that, we can look at how those categories are related to things such as policy preferences or political preferences or other things. So we can also see whether women or men are more likely to be one or the other, whether people more or less educated are more or less likely to be one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That paper is currently under review, so yeah, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
But let's talk about another paper, which is I think a really important paper that was published as part of this project that came out in one of the top political science journals, the American Journal of Political Science. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the key findings from that paper?
Yeah, so that paper, our AJPS paper, I think it's been one of my favorite papers to work on. And what we do, because in a way I can kind of see that as going back to my roots of when I was working on globalization. And so I've always seen a lot of analogies working on these topics between globalization back then and AI now. And so I always thought these two phenomena are actually quite similar, at least from an economic point of view, right? Because both of them can create jobs or they can actually destroy jobs. And they can also have effects on prices. So they can, for instance, lead to lower prices if there is an increase in productivity. And so from an economic point of view, these two phenomena are quite similar. And so in that paper, we start from that premise. And then we ask, well, okay, the economic effects could be similar, but then what are the political consequences going to be? What can we learn from globalization? Because we have seen what happened with globalization. There's been a backlash. We've seen the rise of populism, of the far right, of protectionism. Are we going to see the same thing if we kind of dismiss the losers from AI? And so I think that's kind of the story of how this paper started. And so what we do is, one also innovation that I think we introduced in this paper is to actually look at these two phenomena from this multidimensional perspective. So a lot of the literature focuses on just job loss coming from these different economic shocks, which is a valid concern. But what we do is we kind of try to take a more aggregate view of all of the effects that these shocks could lead to. So not just job loss, but also possibly job gain or no changes, and then possibly no changes in prices or decrease in prices. And so we try and see whether giving people a more aggregate and comprehensive view of the shocks, how that could affect their views of this phenomenon. And so what we do is we have this large sample of American and Canadian voters, and we show them a coin join experiment, which is basically just, we show them repeated treatments. So to give you like a simpler explanation of this, so we tell them that there is a firm that is considering whether to introduce generative AI or offshoring. So people are randomized into two groups. Either they see an offshoring shock or a generative AI shock. And so we tell them that this company wants to introduce, either wants to offshore some of its activities or wants to introduce generative AI in order to lower production costs and possibly lower prices. And that this could lead to some job gains and or some job losses. So that's kind of the intro. And then we give them 4 consecutive tables that show them 4 possible random scenarios of what could happen to a firm deciding to either introduce generative AI or offshore its activities. And these effects basically vary. We let them vary for different types of workers. So we have customer service workers, we have factory workers, we have data scientists. And then, so these numbers could increase or decrease or stay the same. And then we have prices of smartphones, because that's the product that we argue the firm is actually producing. And the prices of the smartphones can either stay the same or go down by different numbers. And so again, they can see 4 different tables, and after each table, we ask them whether they approve of the companies adopting generative AI or offshoring its services. And what we find is very interesting, because what we find is that, first of all, Americans and Canadians, but especially Americans, are much more supportive of AI than they are of offshoring. Mm-hmm. And that's like quite constant across all the different numbers that they can see. So that's the first finding, which is not that surprising, to be honest, because offshoring, globalization have had the chance to be politicized for 20 years, whereas AI has not been politicized yet. So I think that could explain part of this gap. The second finding, which is very interesting, is that people are responsive to the numbers that they see. So when they see prices go down, they become more supportive of both AI and offshoring in the same way. When they see more job losses, they become less supportive. When they see job gains, they become more supportive. The other striking finding, in my opinion, is that people are always as sensitive, if not more sensitive, to prices than they are to employment changes. And I think this is a pretty important finding, considering that we never really previously in the literature looked at these factors at the same time. So I would say that that's probably the most important finding. And then we also can see that people are more sensitive to job losses than job gains, which is not entirely surprising, again. But I guess the interesting part of the story also comes when we look at cross-partisan findings. So we actually want to see if Republicans and Democrats react to these numbers in the same way or not. And I think here there's something interesting about what the future of AI could look like in terms of its politicization. So what we find is that Democrats are the absolute enthusiasts of AI. So under no scenario they become negative about it. Basically, even if they see job losses, they're still above the neutral midpoint in terms of support. Whereas for Republicans, we see that they are still quite excited, but under negative scenarios, they become more neutral. So that's where we say there might be room for the politicization of AI in the future. And basically what we argue in the conclusion is that what this means in the end is that politicians can choose to frame this phenomenon in different ways. And basically whether they're going to emphasize price changes or employment changes might determine basically people's preferences toward it. And we also want to warn about what might happen given what we all know about what happened with globalization and the backlash against globalization. So we also have some implications of our findings, which are maybe we should not, disregard the losers from this current technological change right now, because we've seen what happened with disregarding losers from globalization. So we might want to pass compensatory policies or retraining policies right now before it's too late and we see the rise of protectionism or more inhibitory policies that might have higher costs in the long run.
So that data was collected in 2023,
Yeah.
right in the fall. So that was a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
I'm going to put you on the spot. This may not be fair. You could say no to answering this question, but what do you think's changed since then? I mean, we've gone through elections in both the U.S. and Canada. Yeah. There's been massive political change, economic change, policy change. What do you think has changed in this, with the findings of this paper, perhaps? Or maybe speculate on what you think, you hypothesize what you think might be changing.
So my speculation, and it's not entirely speculation because we've seen more recent surveys with maybe not exactly the same questions, but very similar questions, is that the US election probably had at least a short-term effect on Republicans. And I think it was the specific context because we've seen Donald Trump winning and becoming president. And we've seen the rise of a figure like Elon Musk within the Republican Party. And I think here what's important and interesting is that we can think of this as there is a tension within the Republican Party because we know that there is a Republican base who is actually more skeptical of AI, who are usually, the more uneducated, rural, I would say, older people. But then you have this new fringe within the Republican Party, which we could say, well, now things have changed a little bit in the last few days, but which was kind of represented by Elon Musk. And this is a more, I would say, tech right, which is something relatively new to the Republican Party. And so what I argue is that there is a tension here, right? Because then what direction is the Republican Party going to decide to go in? And what I think is interesting, and at the same time, we could see a backlash against this new tech right from Democrats who were very enthusiastic until a few months ago. And what is very interesting is that from different surveys we've seen from the past few months, again, different questions, but I don't anticipate that it would be that much different as if we ask these ones, is that it seems like we've seen a little bit of a backlash among Democrats especially, so they've become less enthusiastic, and Republicans have become slightly more enthusiastic. And I think this is super interesting. It shows how malleable these views still are, and basically it kind of confirms our story that depending on what politicians, how they decide to frame this, then people are going to go either way. And so I'm curious about whether this trend is there to stay, whether, again, there is a reversal and Democrats are becoming more opposed and Republicans more supportive, or whether it's just a temporary thing.
And we'll be working on that
Yep.
starting later this fall.
Yeah.
All right. So sticking with this paper for a minute, one of the things that I think you mentioned already that's really creative about the way you approach these problems is you are using these large surveys and you're using this conjoint experiment method. And when you talked about it, you mentioned randomization. So can you say a little bit more about why the conjoint experiment is so powerful and so important to use in studies like this?
Yeah. So I think for this specific question, it was like the perfect way to answer this question because, again, we're talking about in the setup, in the theoretical setup, we talk about this multidimensional problem, right? We have several problems, we have several trade-offs. And conjoint experiments do exactly that. So usually survey experiments, what they do is you randomize the treatment into groups, but usually the one thing that there is just one little thing that changes. So everything is identical except for one thing. But in our case, we have several dimensions that we wanted to change. And so that wouldn't be feasible because it would require a humongous sample size of people. And so basically what the conjoint does is it allows us to change multiple features at the same time. So in our example, you can think of these different workers and then these different numbers and then different numbers for prices as well. So we have these different attributes and different values of these attributes. And what it allows us to do is to actually see respectively how one attribute relates to another. So how important it is relative to another. And so it allows us to evaluate these trade-offs, which other methods would allow us to do, but with much, much larger sample sizes, which is usually unfeasible in our field.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful method that you really brought to us here at Caltech because I had never used it before in my own research, and I think we're seeing the power of it, and I've really become convinced that it's a great tool to be using for this kind of research. One other thing about this research project before we move on, you mentioned that it's a collaborative project involving some scholars from all across the country in the U.S. and also Canada. It's kind of a dream team in some sense of 5 scholars, interdisciplinary. So that's kind of, from my perspective, a really interesting characteristic of your approach to studying these problems. You like to assemble teams. Yeah. And bring in different people from different perspectives to study these important problems. How do you do that? How do you construct these teams and put these groups together?
That's a very difficult question. But no, it's true. So to be honest, I have to be honest, it really for me started when I went to Toronto and then even more when I came here. So I didn't have all the opportunities that I was given during my postdocs in graduate school because I wasn't part of a lab. And so it was really, for instance, for me, hard to scramble money to do my dissertation because I wanted to do survey work. And then when I went to Toronto, for the first part, I was part of an actual lab of people, working on different things, usually from different fields, especially at the Schwartz-Risman Institute. It was an institute of technology where you had from political scientists to engineers to public health people. It was like different fields. And so I don't know, that made me really interested in interdisciplinary collaboration, and I learned there how much you could gain from that. But I think that really culminated when I came here, because when I came to Caltech, like Mike's group is really a mix of people with different backgrounds that each one of them brings different things. Like when I came here, I never thought I would write a paper on solar geoengineering with someone that actually works on solar geoengineering and not just from a political science point of view. So to be honest, it's like, I think once you try it, it's really, you realize how much maybe it's also because I'm so obsessed with comparative advantage with like an econ training. To me, that's exactly that. You have all these different people working on the things that they're relatively best off, and the result is much better than if we worked in autarky and each one just worked on their little plot of land.
Yeah, that's great, because that's whenever anybody asks me about interdisciplinary work and also working in teams, that's exactly what I tell them too, that from my perspective, there are certain things I'm good at, there are certain things you're really good at, and by joining forces, the product that we produce is better.
Yeah.
And I find that also I'm glad that you've discovered how fun it is. It's challenging too, sometimes. But so at the same time you've been doing all this cool work on AI and automation since you came here at Caltech. You've also done a lot of work on climate change and sustainability. So can you tell us a little bit about that research that you've been doing for the last 2 years?
Yeah, so speaking of polarization, that's an area. So we just said that there is no polarization in AI yet, so it's not like politicized well. Speaking of that, exact opposite is climate change. And I think what's interesting there is that in a way that frustrated me at the beginning, because on something that is so polarized as climate change, for a political scientist who likes to do survey experiments and see like what works and what doesn't and shifting people attitudes, like you don't shift people attitudes on climate change. I think that's ultimately, or at least most people, that's ultimately one of the things we learn. So you have to be very creative. And so I think I learned a lot, I think, on that front here, especially because I didn't have as much experience with the field. But I think, so both I learned and I brought something. And I think that what I brought is my usual lenses of like, okay, the thinking like an economist perspective, the economic way of thinking perspective. And so one idea that I brought here, and then I worked on it with Mike, and we published that paper in Environmental Politics, was, okay, so how do we overcome this deep polarization? Is there a way that we can make climate change salient also to Republicans or to people who are less likely to be convinced by its existence and also by its answers to it? And so I was thinking, what if we thought about framing this in an economic way rather than as other people have tried in many different other ways? So what if we emphasize the economic dimension of climate change? And so I thought about the simplest case, really. So whenever one takes a class in econ, usually you're introduced to the concept of negative externalities, right? That when you are imposing a cost on a third party that is not part of the transaction, and you're not really paying for it, you're not bearing the cost of it, so you're kind of overdoing it. And that's exactly what like emitting greenhouse gases is to some extent, right? People don't usually pay for that, and so basically they don't bear those costs, and so they emit too much. And so that's like the simple case. And so that's also the reason why there is a simple like economic solution to this, which is a carbon tax, right? So you put a corrective tax on to fix this problem. And so from this very like simple example, I thought, well, usually people think of taxes as revenue collecting mechanisms, right? But corrective taxes are different. They're not really, their primary purpose is not collection of revenues, but it's actually, in this case, it's increasing social welfare by reducing an externality. And so I thought, well, what if we actually framed this in that way? So as, you know, if we framed climate change as a negative externality and we introduced a corrective tax as a solution to that, that would increase social welfare. So we kind of reframed this as, we don't talk about this necessarily as a revenue collective mechanism, but as actually a way to increase social welfare, so to make society better off. Like this might be more popular with people who are usually not super predisposed to this, like such as Republicans. So we tried this, and we did another survey experiment where we framed climate change and corrective taxes as solutions to a negative externality. And what we found, I think, was interesting, because we did not convince any Republicans. But actually, we increased support for carbon taxes, and also we increased the beliefs that the benefits of carbon taxes exceed the costs among independents especially. And the effects for independents were pretty large. Which in a way, it's something we did not anticipate. Right. And so we tried to, basically, we sat down and tried to decide why that happened. And we came to the conclusion that maybe it's because they're less polarized, and that's one hypothesis, and they're more willing to move. Basically, they're more likely to be convinced by these economic arguments. And then we had to try to explain why Republicans didn't move. And I think part of it may be that it's so polarized that, and especially with the recent turn of the Republican Party, that basically there is no argument that, not even an economic argument, is really going to move anyone. And so I guess, yeah, one part of the climate work was that, And then, as I mentioned before, a part of it was about solar geoengineering, which is something I never thought I would work on with someone who actually, like Paul Wenberg here at Caltech, who actually works on it. And what we were interested in was more the political side of it. So basically, this is a new technology, and that is supposed to cool supposedly it can cool the Earth's atmosphere by introducing these reflective particles. Is that right?
Right.
You know better than me. And we're still at the stage where basically the question is not even whether to do it, but whether to research it. So we're still at that stage. But basically we wanted to see, given the fact that obviously scientists recommend the use of that alongside other mechanisms to reduce carbon emissions. So we should have, like, for instance, carbon taxes and all sorts of investing in renewables and so on. But one way that this sometimes has been framed in conservative circles was as a substitutionary way. So, we can continue emitting greenhouse gases if we do that alongside it. And so basically we were curious to see if that rationale would be more or less popular with certain partisan groups or not. And so we did a few studies. First of all, we did an observational survey where we just wanted to see how people felt about solar geoengineering, and whether there was a partisan gap already, as we find with many other climate issues. And one striking finding is that, first of all, over 50% of Americans had never heard of it. So that's the first thing. But then the interesting thing is that, so among people who have never heard of it, you usually see the usual partisan gap. So people who are Republicans are against it, and people who are Democrats are a little bit more in favor in terms of, like, using it as a climate solution. And what is interesting here that we found is that this partisan gap closes a little bit when people actually know about solar geoengineering. So among people who are more familiar with it, the gap between Democrats and Republicans is smaller. So then more Republicans are more likely to think that this could be an effective solution relative to the ones that have never heard about it. They're also more likely to think that there are concerns about it, which is also what the scientific community agrees. And so I think this first observational study led us to our second one, where we really wanted to see whether different framings, including substitutionary ones or complementary ones, would have different effects on different voters. And here what we find, which is in a way depressing, but also striking, is that whenever, and we use another coin joint, whenever you have at the same time both a partisan messenger and a message framing, so whether solar geoengineering could substitute other efforts or whether it should complement other efforts, people don't really care about the message. They just care about who the carrier is. So they just basically become more supportive when it's their own partisan, co-partisan, than when it's their cross-partisan, and then the message doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, it's a fun project,
Yeah.
and it involves talking about interdisciplinary international teams. It involves you and I on the social science side, Paul Wenberg here at Caltech, who's an atmospheric chemist, and Ramit Debnath, who's at the University of Cambridge, who, I don't know how to characterize Ramit. His background's in engineering, he does social science, he does everything. And he's really a lot of fun to work with. It's a great group. Now, believe it or not, so you worked on AI and automation, you worked on climate change and sustainability, and somehow throughout this, you've managed to write a book. And your book is now forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. It's titled, Who Thinks Like an Economist? So tell us a little bit about your book. What are the main findings? What are the main arguments in your book?
Yeah. So let me tell you, before I tell you that, a little bit about how this book...
How it came about.
Exactly, how it came to be.
The origin story.
Because it's a very long story, actually. I was thinking about it a few days ago. The initial ideas came up like 12 years ago. So let me tell you a little bit, because that helps also to contextualize it and contextualize the argument. So it was 2013, and I was much younger then, and I was a master's student at the Collegio Carlo Alberto in Torino. And I was just starting my master's there, and Elsa Fornero, who was an economist who had turned suddenly into a minister during the multi-technocratic government in Italy, she just came back from her government stint to be a professor, what she had always been before. And so let me tell you a little bit about this time in Italy. This was very interesting, and that's also like, I would say the Eurozone crisis is what really got me into this field and interested into econ, political science, and all of that. So in 2011, Italy was on the brink of collapse. Basically, investors turned their back on Italian government debt. The spread between the Italian and the German bonds basically reached the highest level ever. And at the same time, Berlusconi was prime minister in Italy, and his government was characterized by inaction. It was paralyzed. It wasn't doing anything. At that point, the European Union said, you need to pass some structural reforms. You need to signal to markets that you are a credible country. Basically, our debt was 130% of GDP at that time, and basically there was the belief that we would be unable to repay it. And Berlusconi didn't do anything. So in November 2011, he was basically forced to leave, and they put a technocratic government where Mario Monti, who was an economist, a famous economist, he was a EU commissioner, he became the technocratic prime minister. And basically he asked Elsa Fornero, who was a professor at the University of Turin, who had worked on pensions her whole life, he said, you need to put together a pension reform in 20 days. Mm-hmm. So she had 20 days to do what she had been studying her whole life. And basically what she did is she passed this pension reform where, to make a long story short, basically she accelerated the shift to a defined contribution system, and she increased the retirement age quite a lot, because in Italy, I would say it was very generous and very fragmented. I'm not kidding in saying that that reform probably saved the Eurozone. If we still have the Eurozone today and we still have the Euro, I think it's thanks to that reform. Mm-hmm. But she paid a huge personal and political cost. So I met her when she came back from this experience. I actually had the opportunity to collaborate with her. I saw and heard all her stories, and basically she got death threats daily about passing that reform. And so one question that I started asking then and with her was why don't people understand the necessity of these reforms, which clearly have short-term costs but have long-term benefits? And so I started thinking about the fact that we as people who econ students, or then people who become economists, political economists, we tend to think that everybody thinks like economists. But what I realized then, and then also later, is that most people don't think like economists. Mm-hmm. And so basically that's when I decided that would be my research question, what I would dedicate my future dissertation to. And so I would say it started there. And so I started thinking about, what does it mean to think like an economist, and how is it different from how most other people think? And so to make it short, what I argue is that there are different mental models. And I argue that there is an economist mental model, which is what people who think like economists use. And what distinguishes these people is that they're usually familiar with fundamental economic concepts, like things such as inflation, supply and demand, unemployment, these things. And they apply economic reasoning to pretty much every question around them. So they use cost-benefit analysis, they use opportunity costs, they use marginal analysis, they understand interdependence, that something that happens here now is going to affect other things, so that there are not just first-order effects, but second, third, and so on. And so basically by putting together this knowledge of economic concepts and this economic way of thinking, then they're better able to predict the effects of policies, and they're more likely to choose policies that maximize aggregate welfare. And what I argue is that there are alternative mental models, mm-hmm. and that I don't really dive into the difference between them as much, which I think is a topic for future research. Mm-hmm. But what I argue is that a lot of people don't use the economist mental model. They don't think in terms of costs and benefits. They're much more likely to rely on things such as heuristics or partisan cues, or think about the first order effects. So they're more likely to resort often to zero-sum thinking. And so to think that, when somebody gains, somebody else has to lose. Or that when we introduce tariffs, the only effect is going to be that we're going to save this one job here, and that this is not going to have repercussions on the rest of the economy. Or that if we introduce a price control, prices are going to get lower, and that's the end of the chain. And so what I then argue is that this doesn't mean that, people who think like economists and maximize aggregate welfare don't think about distributional consequences, and I think that's an important thing. I actually think it's quite the opposite. They know that there are winners and losers from these policies, and they know that the costs of compensating losers with unemployment benefits, for instance, or with retraining, those costs are a lot lower than the costs of protectionism, so of not, or of not doing anything, because then there's going to be opposition to these welfare-enhancing reforms. So that's another thing. And then what I argue is that these people are also more likely, so the economic way of thinking is also more likely to be inducive to positive sum thinking, because then you learn things such as comparative advantage or like the time value of money and all these things that make you basically more likely to be patient, especially when and I showed in an experiment that's the case. You become more patient because you learn about things such as the time value of money. So you're better able to weigh intertemporal trade-offs, so things such as when you see short-term costs and the benefits are only going to be manifested later. But you're also more likely to see that most exchanges are positive sum. And so it goes back to our collaboration example. And so this is not just like a theory. I use a lot of data to actually demonstrate this. And I demonstrate this across very different contexts. So first of all, I try to measure economic knowledge in many different ways, which is basically trying to measure the economic way of thinking. And then I test whether people who are more likely to think like economists are more likely, for instance, to favor welfare-enhancing reforms in several contexts. So I do that in Italy, in the UK, and in the US. I show that that's the case regardless of whether in the short run you're a winner or loser from globalization, for instance. So I show that if you think like an economist, even if you're a loser from globalization in the short run, you're more likely to favor welfare-enhancing reforms. And then I show with an experiment that I did at the University of Washington among students that, okay, so the question here is, why do people who are short-term losers, why, if they think like economists, they're more likely to favor these welfare-enhancing reforms? And my hypothesis is that this has to do with patience. This has to do with longer time horizons. That this has to do with longer time horizons. And so what I do is, okay, let's see if students who learn about things such as the time value of money, discounting, and all of that, let's see if these people at the end of that class, if they have lower discount rates. So basically, if they are more patient. But then another problem with that question is, well, even if I find that, it's possible that people who self-select into econ already are more patient to start with. And the other problem is that if I don't test it with another type of class, I don't know if it's actually taking any college class that makes us more patient. So I do all of that. And what's interesting and what I find is that learning these concepts indeed decreases discount rates, so it makes people more patient, and there isn't a self-selection effect. So when people self-select into poli-sci or econ, because I test that with poli-sci students, their discount rates are not different to start with, but then they change depending on the class that they take. And so I take that to mean that people who learn to think like economists basically are better able to weigh the intertemporal trade-offs of different policies. And then I show other things that I show, again, is this connection with zero-sum thinking. So I show that people who are more likely to think like economists are less likely to be zero-sum thinkers. They're more positive sum, and they're more likely to favor policies like trade and immigration. I also show that, to talk a little bit more again about the difference between aggregate versus distributional effects, I show that people who think like economists are more likely to favor compensatory policies and retraining policies rather than protectionism, and the opposite is true of those that don't think like economists. And then I think the most interesting finding of all is the part about information. So I argue that these different types of people with different mental models actually use different types of information to update their beliefs. Mm-hmm. And so what I find is that I would say two very interesting things. First of all, what I find is that people who think like economists are more likely to use economic information to update their beliefs. And they do update their beliefs based on whether they see costs as outweighing the benefits or vice versa on issues such as globalization or AI. And this is very important because this basically defends me against the critique that, these people are just ideological. But I actually show that when the costs of trade exceed the benefits, they become more negative about it. Mm-hmm. And they shift when the benefits outweigh the costs. What's interesting is people who don't think like economists, they don't move with the economic information. Their views do not change based on that. But here's the twist. Somebody could argue that, well, it's because they don't care as much about economic values. Mm-hmm. But it's not true, because I asked them that. I asked them how they think each objective of trade policy is important to them, and they care about economic objectives as much as people who think like economists, if not more, when it comes, for instance, to prices. So it's not just about a difference in values. And I think this is where, in the end, my main contribution is, because a lot of the literature has focused on answering questions on, because the key question here is, why do people support policies that are harmful in the end, right? And then a lot of the literature focuses on two things. One says, it's all about political economy and it's like about your own self-interest. And the other side says, no, it's actually, you assume that people only care about self-interest, but people care about other things. So there are cultural explanations. And I think my story goes beyond that because it argues that it's not merely about differences in values, but it's about differences in mental models. So in how you see the world, in your cognitive framework.
That's great. I've read the book a couple of times, and it's going to be an important book, and I'm really excited that it's coming out. Do you know when we can expect to see it on the bookshelves?
I hope so. I hope within 6 months.
Okay, so that would be sometime in the fall of 2025.
Yeah.
Right, that'll be exciting. So, was it fun to write a book? I mean, this is your first book. Did you enjoy it? What were some of the challenges?
So I enjoyed it a lot. It was a lot more fun than I ever thought it would be. Mm-hmm. But there were definitely challenges, I think, for the most part, especially when, you've worked for so many years on many different things, like finding the unifying thread it's not always easy. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was about like finding that unifying thread and then putting together this disparate amount of work and papers and ideas that I had. And I think like my mentors, like Victor Minaldo at UW, Peter Lowen, now at Cornell, and you, Mike, have been especially instrumental, I think, at every stage of this process, and especially you with the last push, which I think was the most important one, which was actually, telling me how to do it, like how to contact an editor and like what the process is like and setting aside time to just do that. But I don't know, at least for me, it was very rewarding because it was, I don't know, I think it kind of it's part of my identity, that book, as an academic.
Yeah, it's fun to write books. I'm actually looking forward to having an opportunity soon to start writing one of my own. But so now you're going to start making this transition to being a professor at Northeastern. What are you most excited about as you make that transition?
I think going back to teaching, because I haven't taught in 4 years. So I'm really excited about going back to teaching, and especially teaching about AI, which is something I've been so excited about and that I haven't had the chance to teach about, and also collaborating with people from so many different departments working on AI. I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, well, it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to seeing that syllabus and maybe having an opportunity to learn more about how you're teaching a class like that too, because it's a challenge to try to teach a subject like that because it's changing so rapidly. Right.
Yeah.
So in any case, thanks for being with me today. Thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with you. We've just absolutely loved having you here at Caltech. You've been a real wonderful addition to the work that the center does, to the work that my research group does, but also to me personally. So thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing our work And,
too.
look forward to seeing you as you make that transition to Northeastern.
Thank you. And I had the time of my life here, so no, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks.
Thank you.